The quiet hum of a well-kept suburban neighborhood, the sound of sprinklers spraying across freshly mown lawns, a golden sunset fading over the horizon. Everything seems peaceful. But beneath this veneer of suburban serenity lies a storm, one that had been quietly brewing for years, until it was ignited by a single, fateful act. This is the story of a marriage gone wrong, of a love twisted into something darker, something far more dangerous. It's the story of Kayla and Jordan Daniels, a seemingly ordinary couple, until one night, the unthinkable happened. In the dead of night, in the quietest hour, something broke, something shattered beyond repair. Kayla stood there, knife in hand, her apology just as sharp as the blade. She said sorry, then turned the knife. Kayla's hands trembled as she stood over her husband's lifeless body, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. In those final moments, she whispered words that would haunt her forever. "I'm sorry, Jordan. I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to end like this. It wasn't supposed to be this violent. But love, as we know, has a dark side, and so does revenge." Before we begin, like this video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more intriguing stories. Now let's begin. Kayla Daniels, an ambitious, soft-spoken woman who had once dreamed of a life full of joy, with a house full of children, and a husband who adored her. But things had changed in ways no one could see coming. She wasn't always this cold, this calculating. Once, Kayla had been the kind of woman who could make a room feel warm with just a smile. But something had shifted. Something had twisted inside her, until the woman she once was became a stranger in her own life. Her marriage, her home, everything she held dear became a prison, and she was its only inmate. In the years leading up to the murder, things had been off. Jordan, the man she had loved so deeply, had become a different person. He had grown cold, indifferent, distant, until eventually their connection dissolved entirely. The laughter they once shared faded into the background noise of broken promises, trust shattered, and love lost. Yet Kayla had stayed. For better or worse, for richer or poorer, she stayed. Maybe it was out of fear of what might happen if she left. Or maybe it was because the love she once felt for him had been twisted, warped into something she couldn't recognize, but couldn't let go. But by the time the knife fell, by the time the blood stained her hands, she had no choice. At least, that's what she told herself. Jordan Daniels was a man caught in the grip of his own demons. On the surface, he was the perfect husband, the perfect provider, a successful businessman, respected in his community. But under the polished exterior was a man plagued by secrets. Secrets that not even Kayla knew. Jordan's infidelity had been the first crack in their marriage. It started small, innocent enough, missed calls, late nights at the office. But then the late nights became more frequent, and the calls, well, they were no longer missed, just ignored. Kayla's heart, once overflowing with love, slowly turned to ice. She felt betrayed, trapped in a marriage with a man who no longer saw her, who no longer valued her, and yet she remained. Why? Maybe it was because she believed things could change. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she was still holding onto the love that once existed between them. A love that was fading, slipping through her fingers like sand in the wind. But Jordan's betrayal was only the beginning. Behind closed doors, he had been hiding much more: his lies, his debts, his dangerous connections. Jordan wasn't just unfaithful, he was living a double life. And when the truth came out, it hit Kayla like a ton of bricks. The day Kayla discovered the truth about Jordan's infidelity was the day everything changed. It wasn't just a text message or a phone call that revealed his betrayal. It was a discovery, a set of photographs, damning evidence of the life Jordan had been living behind her back. He had been seeing another woman, and not just any woman, someone who was entangled in a dangerous, underworld lifestyle that Kayla had never imagined. Her whole world crumbled in an instant. In that moment, something inside Kayla snapped. All the years of deception, of quiet hurt, came crashing down in a wave of fury and betrayal. She felt the weight of every lie, every unspoken word, pressing down on her chest. It was suffocating, it was painful, and in that moment she knew She could never go back. But what could she do? What choice did she have? Days passed in a haze of anger and disbelief. Kayla tried to salvage what little remained of her marriage, but each attempt only made the pain worse. She confronted Jordan, demanded answers, but he denied everything. The woman in the photos? Just a co-worker. The late nights? Just business. And yet, deep down, Kayla knew the truth that had been eating at her for months. Jordan didn't just betray her. He betrayed everything they had built together. Their love, their trust, their family. None of it mattered to him, and the more Kayla tried to hold on, the more she realized there was nothing left to save. But Kayla wasn't the same woman she used to be. She had become someone else, someone capable of doing what needed to be done, even if that meant taking justice into her own hands. And so, on a quiet night, in the comfort of their home, she made the decision that would change everything. She couldn't just walk away. No, this was more than betrayal. This was personal. Sorry wasn't enough. When she said those words, with trembling hands and a heart heavy with regret, she didn't just apologize for her actions. She apologized for everything that had led to this point. The pain, the lies, the betrayal. But in that instant, she knew she had already crossed the line. And as the knife entered Jordan's chest, Kayla whispered one last time, "I'm sorry." But there's more to this story. Far more than anyone could ever imagine. And Kayla, standing over the body of her husband, had no idea that what would come next would test her sanity, her strength, and her soul. The scene of the crime was chaotic, a chilling testament to the violence that had unfolded in what was supposed to be the sanctity of a shared home. The paramedics had come, but by then it was too late. Jordan Daniels was gone. Kayla was arrested, her once soft hands now bound by the cold embrace of cuffs. But in the interrogation room, she wasn't the calm, composed woman who had smiled through dinner parties and family gatherings. She wasn't the broken wife who had lost everything. No, in that room, Kayla was something else entirely. A woman trapped by the consequences of her own actions. She sat there, trembling, her face pale, her eyes wide, haunted. For a moment, she almost seemed to vanish into the shadows of the room, her voice small, her words hanging in the air like an apology she couldn't take back. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, as if her apology could bring Jordan back. "I'm so sorry." But even as she spoke, the officers knew something was missing, something that didn't add up. Detective Karen Price had seen it all. The heartbreak, the lies, the betrayals. But this was different. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Something was off. It wasn't just the brutal murder of a man in his prime, nor the fact that his wife stood over his body, knife in hand. No, what troubled her most were the cracks in Kayla's story. The officers had found no sign of a struggle. Jordan's body had been found in the bedroom, but there was no sign of a break-in, no forced entry, no sign that anything was amiss beyond the chaos of the stabbing. Everything looked normal. Too normal. That's what kept Detective Price awake at night. Jordan Daniels had been murdered by someone close to him, someone who knew him, who could walk into his house and catch him off guard. But the question was, why did Kayla do it? Why kill him in such a brutal manner? It was clear Kayla had been hurt. The infidelity, the lies, the betrayal. But why the knife? Why the sudden act of violence? As Detective Price dove deeper into Jordan's life, a new layer of the story began to emerge. A dark side to Jordan that no one had known about, not even his wife. Jordan Daniels had been a man with dangerous ties. He had been involved in business dealings that skirted the edge of legality, operating in a world of shady connections and criminal activities. The detectives discovered that Jordan's company, a technology firm he had built from the ground up, was not as legitimate as it appeared. Behind the polished boardrooms and clean-cut image, Jordan was tied to illegal arms deals, smuggling, and money laundering. But even more damning, he had been using his position to launder money for a powerful criminal syndicate that had been operating in the shadows of the city for years. Detective Price found records, hidden in a locked file on Jordan's office computer, that linked him to a network of men who operated outside the law. One of those men, Big Earl Thompson, was a well-known figure in the underground world. a ruthless figure who had no qualms about eliminating anyone who crossed him. Jordan's involvement with Big Earl wasn't just a business relationship. It was a dangerous alliance that had cost him his freedom, his peace, and ultimately his life. But Kayla had known none of this. Or had she? Kayla's story didn't seem to fit the narrative. Yes, she had been devastated by Jordan's betrayal. But was that enough to push her to murder? As Detective Price dug deeper, she started to question whether there was more to the story than Kayla was letting on. Was it really just the infidelity that drove her to kill? Or had Jordan's criminal activities dragged her into a web she couldn't escape? Kayla had been the perfect wife, at least on the surface. But now, Detective Price couldn't shake the feeling that Kayla had known more than she had let on. She had kept the house in order, arranged the finances, and even attended the same high-end charity events as Jordan's shady associates. Had Kayla been aware of her husband's criminal dealings? Had she been complicit in the crimes? The breakthrough came when a fellow employee from Jordan's company came forward, a woman named Trina Harris, who had worked with Jordan for years and had seen the gradual unraveling of his professional life. She explained how Jordan had become more secretive, more paranoid, in the months leading up to his death. It wasn't just the affair that had shaken Kayla. It was the fact that Jordan had started making dangerous moves, cutting off connections, deleting files, and discussing getting out of the business. In the last few weeks before his death, he had been telling those closest to him that he wanted to disappear, that he had made a deal with someone in the criminal world to save himself and his family. But in the end, Jordan had been cornered, his web of lies catching up with him. The final days before his murder had been filled with tension. Jordan had been nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing that his dealings with Big Earl would finally come back to haunt him. And then, in the darkest hour, Kayla had been the one to pull the trigger. Was it revenge for betrayal, or something far darker? Kayla had said sorry, but the question lingered. Was her apology genuine, or was it a mask to hide something far more sinister? As Detective Price analyzed the evidence, the pieces started to fit together. Jordan's criminal ties were dangerous enough to warrant a murder, but could it be that Kayla wasn't just a victim of betrayal? Had she been swept up in Jordan's dangerous world? Or had she been part of it all along? It was becoming clearer. This was no ordinary case of a wife scorned. This was the story of a woman who had been willing to kill to protect something much larger than love. The more Detective Price uncovered, the more the truth slipped further into the shadows. Was Kayla a victim of circumstance? Or was she the mastermind behind it all? Kayla Daniels sat quietly in the dimly lit interrogation room, her eyes hollow, as if the weight of what she had done was finally sinking in. The silence between her and Detective Price was deafening, the air thick with unspoken words. Kayla's hands were folded on the table in front of her, but her knuckles were white, betraying the tension running through her. The detective studied her, trying to make sense of the woman sitting across from her. Kayla seemed so ordinary, so fragile. How could she have been capable of murder? And yet, in the quiet of the room, Kayla's presence felt like a storm waiting to erupt. It was then that Detective Price decided to make her move, a move that would pull at the threads of Kayla's story, unraveling the mystery further. "Kayla," Detective Price began, her voice calm yet deliberate. "We found something I think you need to explain." Kayla's breath hitched. She was trying to appear composed, but it was clear from the way her eyes flickered that she was rattled. I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But Detective Price wasn't fooled. A recording, a phone call made just hours before Jordan's death. It was clear. Kayla had called someone the night Jordan was murdered. The number had been traced, and the voice on the other end was not one Kayla had ever mentioned. Detective Price played the recording for her, watching Kayla's reaction closely. "Kayla," the voice on the phone said, low and menacing, "you know what needs to be done. There's no going back now. Do what you have to do." The voice was unfamiliar, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. Kayla's face drained of color. She closed her eyes, as if hoping the truth would stay buried. For the first time, Kayla spoke, her words barely above a whisper. I didn't want to I didn't plan for it to happen like this." Detective Price's heart pounded in her chest. The phone call was a pivotal piece of the puzzle, one that had been hiding in plain sight. It wasn't just a case of infidelity gone wrong. There was more to this story, something far more sinister. The voice on the other end of the call wasn't just someone Kayla had been confiding in. It was a figure from Jordan's dark world, someone connected to the very criminal syndicate that had been lurking beneath the surface of Jordan's life. But who? Price spent hours running the name through the system, cross-referencing every lead, until she finally found it. The name belonged to Tariq Davis, a well-known figure in the underground world, a trusted enforcer for Big Earl. Tariq was a man whose reputation was built on fear, and his influence spread far and wide in the criminal underworld. But why was Kayla calling him? And what had he meant when he told her to do what you have to do? The truth was becoming murkier by the second. The more Price uncovered, the more it seemed like Kayla's involvement went far deeper than simple revenge. As the investigation continued, a chilling picture began to emerge. Kayla Daniels had not been a passive victim in her marriage. She had been complicit in Jordan's dealings from the very beginning. In fact, it seemed she had been far more involved than anyone had realized. It all came to light in a conversation with Trina Harris, Jordan's longtime employee. Trina explained that in the months leading up to Jordan's death, Kayla had been seen meeting with men who were not part of her usual social circle. She had been involved in business meetings, and though her role was never clear, it was obvious that her presence wasn't just that of a concerned wife. Kayla had known about Jordan's dealings with Big Earl, and she had not only tolerated them, but had helped him navigate them. She had known about the criminal activities, the money laundering, and the illegal arms deals. And though she had initially appeared to be unaware of the danger her husband was in, the reality was much darker. As Detective Price dug deeper into Kayla's relationship with Tariq Davis, a new detail came to light. A conversation Kayla had had with him just weeks before Jordan's murder. The two had discussed the possibility of clearing up loose ends. What did that mean? Had Jordan, in his desperation, been planning to cut ties with Big Earl, to sever the connections that had trapped him in a life of crime? Was Kayla, fearing for their future, involved in a plot to silence him? Kayla had been fighting her own war, one that had nothing to do with Jordan's infidelity. Her emotional ties to him were only a small piece of the puzzle. What had driven her to murder was something deeper, something buried beneath layers of manipulation, fear, and calculated decisions. The more Price uncovered, the more she realized that Kayla wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a woman driven by a desire to protect herself, her wealth, and her place in a world she was now tied to by blood and betrayal. With Kayla's phone records now fully analyzed, Detective Price learned something crucial. Kayla had reached out to Tariq Davis, not just once, but multiple times in the weeks leading up to Jordan's death. Each call was more urgent than the last, and each conversation revolved around the same thing: money. Jordan had been planning to cut ties with Big Earl's organization, to free himself and Kayla from the web of crime that had entangled them. But Kayla, trapped in a life she couldn't escape, had other plans. She had become too comfortable with the wealth, the power, and the security that came with her connection to the criminal world. And when Jordan threatened to break free, it had sent her into a panic. She wasn't just angry about his affair. She was angry that he had threatened to take everything from her. And in her mind, the only way to protect herself and her future was to take control, to eliminate him before he could escape the very world that had consumed them both. Kayla had planned the murder, but it wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated act of self-preservation. She had used the affair, the emotional betrayal, to justify the act in her mind. But deep down, she knew the truth. This was never about love. It was about power. And in the end, she was willing to sacrifice everything, even Jordan, to hold on to it. With Tariq Davis now a central figure in the investigation, Detective Price prepared to confront him. But the deeper she dug into Kayla's involvement, the more the case seemed to spiral into darkness. What role had Big Earl played in all of this? Was there more to Kayla's plan than anyone realized? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, would Kayla ever confess the true motive behind her husband's murder? Or would she continue to hide behind the web of lies she had so carefully spun? The interrogation room felt colder now. Kayla had been here before, the weight of her guilt heavier with each passing minute. Detective Price had given her space, allowed her to stew in her silence, but it was now time for the final confrontation, the moment when the truth would be dragged into the light. Kayla's face was a mask of sorrow, her eyes wide, like someone who had been running from something for far too long. But what was she running from? What part of herself had she buried so deep that even now, when the evidence was stacked against her, she couldn't let go of the lies? Kayla, Detective Price began, her voice cutting through the quiet. You've been protecting someone. You've been protecting something. It's time to face the consequences of your actions. Kayla's gaze flickered, her breath shallow. For the first time, she seemed truly afraid. Her fingers fidgeted nervously with the cuffs that bound her wrists, but still, she said nothing, her lips pressed together, the regret hanging in the air like an unwelcome guest. But Price wasn't backing down. Why? Why did you kill him? The question wasn't just a simple inquiry. It was the piercing truth that Kayla had been avoiding from the start. Kayla's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the room seemed to grow even colder. She finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of secrets. I never wanted to, she began, her eyes darting away from Price's gaze. I loved him. I really did, but Jordan, he was a part of something I couldn't escape. The lies, the danger, the choices we made, they weren't just his anymore. They were mine too. Kayla's eyes welled up, the mask of stoic composure, cracking just enough to show the woman beneath. The woman who had been forced into a world she never wanted. The woman who had slowly become someone else. I found out about the affair, yes, but that wasn't it. It wasn't about him sleeping with someone else. It was what it meant for us. What it meant for everything we'd built together. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. I knew he was planning to leave it all behind. He was going to tell Big Earl and everyone else that we were out, that we were done with all of it, and I couldn't let him. If he left, if he walked away from them, we'd both be dead. He didn't understand how dangerous those people were, how dangerous he was. Jordan thought he could just walk away, and we'd be fine. But I knew better. I knew we had no way out, not when we were tied to them. The words hung in the air like a blade. Big Earl had been a shadow over their lives for years, and it wasn't just Jordan who had been involved. Kayla had been a willing accomplice in a game of manipulation, one that had ensnared her far deeper than she realized. Price leaned in, sensing the depth of what was being revealed. So, it wasn't just the affair. You were afraid of what would happen if Jordan tried to walk away from Big Earl. You were afraid that you both would be killed, weren't you? Kayla nodded, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. Yes, I was terrified, but I couldn't show that. I couldn't let Jordan know how scared I was. I couldn't let him know how deep we were into this mess. Her voice broke as the words tumbled out. I knew what they did to people who tried to leave. I saw it in the faces of the men who worked for Big Earl. I saw it in the eyes of the women who got too close. If Jordan had left, if he had betrayed Big Earl like that, we would have been dead before we could take our next breath. As the confession came pouring out, it became clear. Kayla's mind had been a battlefield, torn between love, fear, and survival. Her decision wasn't simply about killing her husband out of rage. It was a choice born of terror and desperation, a desperate attempt to secure a future that she couldn't escape. I tried to warn him, she continued, wiping her eyes. I begged him to stop, to stay quiet, to just leave it all alone. But Jordan, he didn't listen. He thought he could just walk away like it was nothing. Kayla's words were like daggers now, each sentence a sharp turn in a story she'd been hiding for so long. I had no choice, Detective. He wouldn't listen. He wouldn't understand. I had to do it. It wasn't for me. It was for us. If I didn't stop him, we were both as good as dead. In that moment, everything began to fall into place. Kayla had been a part of the criminal world long before she ever raised a knife against Jordan. It wasn't just the affair or Jordan's reckless attempt to break free. It was a battle for survival, one that had started the day they made the decision to walk into Big Earl's world. But what about Tarek Davis? What role had he played in all of this? Price had been piecing together the events leading up to Jordan's death, and there was one detail that stood out. Tarek Davis had been Kayla's link to Big Earl, the one person she had trusted to protect her. But it wasn't just protection she had been seeking, it was control. She had become tangled in the same world of violence and power that had consumed her husband. Tarek had been the one to orchestrate the plan, to guide her every step of the way. He was the one who had told her what needed to be done, who had urged her to make the final decision. And in return, Kayla would be given a way out, a way to escape the life that had nearly destroyed her. But in the end, there was no escape. No matter how carefully Kayla had tried to control the situation, no matter how much she had convinced herself that it was for the greater good, the cost of her actions was far greater than she could have ever imagined. The moment Jordan had been murdered, Kayla had sealed her fate. But the story didn't end with his death. It was only just beginning. Kayla had killed the man she loved, driven by a twisted sense of loyalty. But the consequences were just beginning to unfold. As Detective Price left the interrogation room, she knew that this case was far from over. The deeper she delved into the criminal empire that had controlled Kayla and Jordan's lives, the more tangled the web became. Big Earl was still out there, pulling the strings from the shadows. But the most chilling part of this revelation was the question that lingered in the air. What would Kayla do next? Was she truly remorseful, or had she simply gotten rid of the man who stood between her and her future? Was there more to her role in the murder than she was letting on? And what about Tarek Davis? Was he just a pawn in a much larger game? Or was he a mastermind playing his own dangerous game? As Detective Price sat at her desk, poring over the details of the case, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't just in the past. It was still ahead. The murder of Jordan Daniels was only the beginning. The investigation into Kayla Daniels' life was far from over. What seemed like a simple case of betrayal and murder was, in fact, a dark, convoluted tale, one of deceit, power, and survival. Detective Karen Price had uncovered more than she bargained for. As she pored over the case files, one thing became clear. Kayla's involvement in Jordan's death was only the beginning of a much larger story. Behind closed doors, a dangerous alliance had been forged, a world that Kayla had willingly entered, and in many ways, helped shape. But now, with her confession on the table, the pieces were starting to connect in a way that would bring the entire empire down. Kayla Daniels' motives were starting to crystallize. She had claimed she killed Jordan to protect herself and their future, but that wasn't the whole truth. The more Detective Price dug, the more she realized that Kayla's role in this murder wasn't simply out of fear. Kayla had been more than just a passive participant in Jordan's criminal world. In fact, she had become a willing player, someone who understood the stakes of the game they were playing. And as she revealed her darkest fears in the interrogation room, it became evident. Kayla had been looking for a way out, but instead, she had dug herself deeper. Price leaned in as Kayla spoke, her voice trembling but steady. I thought I could make it work. If I just kept quiet, if I played along, Big Earl would spare us, she confessed, eyes downcast. But it wasn't just about us anymore. I had become someone else, someone who was too involved. The more Kayla spoke, the more Price understood that she hadn't just been trying to protect herself from Big Earl's wrath. No, Kayla had seen an opportunity in Jordan's downfall, a way to ascend, to take control of the empire they had built together. I knew Big Earl, Kayla continued, her voice laced with regret. He doesn't care about people like us. People like Jordan, people like me. He uses us. He manipulates us. But I thought if I did the right thing, if I made the right moves, I could be more than just another pawn in his game. I could be someone who controls the game. As Detective Price went deeper into Kayla's life, it became clear that Jordan wasn't the only one involved in criminal activities. Kayla had been there from the start, using her charm and ambition to navigate the dangerous waters of organized crime. She had seen Jordan's success as an opportunity, an opportunity that had drawn her into a world where loyalty meant nothing and betrayal was currency. Kayla's involvement with Big Earl's syndicate wasn't just about survival, it was about power. She had helped launder money, facilitate illegal arms deals, and set up shell companies that were used to funnel dirty money into legitimate businesses. She had been a key player in the operation, a woman who had turned her back on everything she once stood for. But when Jordan decided to break away from the criminal underworld, Kayla's world began to unravel. Her hold on the empire, the wealth, and the power she had been so carefully cultivating was slipping. And in the chaotic world of organized crime, there was only one way to hold on to it: force. As Kayla's role in the murder became clearer, so too did the identity of the man who had been pulling her strings, Tarek Davis. He wasn't just a henchman for Big Earl. He was a calculating, ruthless figure who had been using Kayla to further his own ambitions. He had been the one to offer her a way out, if she played her cards right. If she could kill Jordan, if she could solidify her loyalty to Big Earl, he would ensure her place at the top. But Tarek wasn't just manipulating Kayla. He had his own agenda. Price discovered that Tarek had been angling for control of Big Earl's empire. He had been working behind the scenes, planning to take over once Big Earl's grip weakened. And Kayla, who thought she was securing her future, had been nothing more than a pawn in Tarek's game. The twisted part of it all was that Kayla knew this, at least subconsciously. She had wanted to escape Jordan's toxic grip, to break free from the chains of a marriage that had become a prison. But in doing so, she had simply exchanged one form of control for another. As Price dug into Tarek's life, she found connections that linked him to multiple unsolved murders, violent shakedowns, and illegal activities that stretched back years. Tarek was not just a criminal. He was a man willing to go to any lengths to get what he wanted. And Kayla, in her desperation, had helped him. But Tarek wasn't the true mastermind Big Earl was. The enigmatic leader of the syndicate had remained mostly in the shadows, a figure who controlled everything from behind the scenes. But now, Detective Price was getting closer to uncovering his true role in the murder. Big Earl's influence stretched far and wide, and his connection to Kayla was far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Kayla had been involved with him long before Jordan's death, but she had never fully understood the extent of his control. He had manipulated her, using her as both a shield and a tool, all while keeping her in the dark about the full scope of his operations. As Price dug through the financial records, it became clear that Big Earl had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. He had arranged for Jordan's murder, using Tarek as a middleman, all while keeping his own hands clean. In the world of organized crime, this was the ultimate betrayal, using someone's own fears and ambitions against them to secure control. Price stood at the precipice now, the truth within reach. Kayla had been played, used as a pawn in a deadly game of power, and yet she had played her part willingly. There was no innocence in her actions. She had chosen this path. She had chosen to kill her husband, and she had chosen to embrace the darkness that came with it. But now, with the full scope of the operation revealed, Price had a new question to answer. Was Kayla a victim in all of this, or was she simply a woman who had chosen power over morality? Had she truly been manipulated, or had she sought the same power that had corrupted her husband? As Price reviewed the final pieces of the investigation, she knew one thing for certain. Kayla's fate was now sealed. She had played her part, but the consequences were far from over. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Detective Karen Price stood outside the courthouse, watching the relentless downpour, her mind racing. The investigation had taken her into the darkest corners of the criminal world, revealing secrets that had remained buried for years. But as the rain soaked her coat, she knew the case was far from over. There was still one last battle to be fought. Kayla Daniels had confessed to the murder of her husband, but the deeper truth was far more complex. Kayla had been a pawn in a larger game, one played by Big Earl and his criminal empire, with Tarek Davis as the shadowy enforcer. Yet, as much as Price wanted to close this chapter, there was one undeniable fact. Kayla had made a choice. She had chosen to protect herself, to climb the ladder of power, and in doing so, she had condemned herself. With Tarek in custody, Price's next target was clear: Big Earl. The elusive kingpin, the mastermind behind everything that had happened, was the only one left standing in the shadows. The connections were there, the money trails, the witnesses, but the man himself had remained untouchable for years. He had woven a web so complex that even the most experienced officers were afraid to follow it. But Detective Price was no stranger to danger, and she knew this was the end of the road. She had one last lead: a phone call, intercepted just hours before Big Earl was to make his escape. He had been tipped off by someone within his own circle, and now the game was coming to a head. Price had no time to waste. She tracked down every last lead, coordinated with the FBI, and after a tense standoff, Big Earl was captured. His empire crumbled beneath the weight of the evidence, the lies, and the deaths he had caused. The man who had once ruled with fear was now shackled and on his way to face justice. But even in his downfall, Big Earl remained unfazed, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you've won?" he sneered at Price as they led him away. "This world doesn't change. It just adapts. There's always someone ready to take my place." And then there was Kayla. As the dust settled and the criminal syndicate collapsed, Detective Price turned her attention back to the woman who had started it all. Kayla Daniels, who had been both a victim and an accomplice, now had to face the consequences of her actions. Kayla's trial was a media sensation, but in the end, there was no escaping the truth. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet, as the gavel fell, Kayla didn't show the signs of regret one might expect. She had lived her life with the weight of ambition, betrayal, and fear. But now, she would have to live with the reality of the consequences. She had made her choices, and those choices had cost her everything. Kayla's story was one of corruption, but it was also one of survival. She had been manipulated, but she had also made decisions with full knowledge of what they would bring. She had chosen power over love, self-preservation over honesty, and in the end, it had destroyed her. In the end, this story is about more than just murder or betrayal. It's about the choices we make and the cost of those choices. Kayla Daniels had every chance to walk away, to rebuild her life without the darkness of the criminal underworld. But the lure of power, the promise of security, and the desire to escape her pain led her down a path she couldn't return from. Kayla's downfall was a consequence of the choices she made in the name of survival, but it was also the result of her failure to recognize the value of integrity, honesty, and love. She had built her life on a foundation of lies, and in the end, it wasn't just her marriage that fell apart. It was everything. The real tragedy here is that Kayla, like so many of us, was seduced by the idea of control, by the belief that power could solve everything. But in reality, power without morality leads only to destruction. In the quest for personal gain, we lose sight of what truly matters: connection, trust, and truth. As you reflect on Kayla Daniels' journey, remember this: the choices we make today will echo in our lives tomorrow. The search for power, when driven by fear and self-interest, can easily lead us astray. But in the end, the price of that power is often higher than we ever imagined. So, what do you think? What would you have done if you were in Kayla's shoes? Would you have made different choices? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear the story, and subscribe for more gripping tales that delve deep into the complexities of human nature, justice, and morality. Until next time, remember, the truth is out there, but only if you're willing to look for it.